You don't survive Black Ops by being the loudest person in the room. You survive by being the one nobody remembers. For 3 years, the only thing Danielle Foster flew was economy class, pushing a beverage cart down a narrow aisle at 35,000 feet. Nobody on Flight 227 knew her real name. Not the one that mattered anyway. The cabin smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee. Danielle moved through it the way she moved through everything now, quiet, efficient, invisible. She poured a ginger ale for a nervous flyer in 12A. She refolded a blanket for a sleeping toddler in 9C. Her hands never shook. They hadn't shaken in years, not even when they probably should have. Captain Mike Reynolds barely looked at her during the pre-flight briefing. To him, she was just crew, reliable, quiet, forgettable. He had no idea she'd once been the kind of person governments called when things went wrong in places that didn't officially exist. Danielle liked it that way. Anonymity was its own kind of armor. Somewhere over the Atlantic, for hours into a red-eye to London, a man in seat 22F stood up and pulled a box cutter from his sleeve. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this one, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, hit that subscribe button, and give this video a like. It really does help the channel. Now let's get back to 35,000 feet. The blade caught the cabin light for half a second before anyone screamed. Danielle was 3 rows back, cart braked at 19C, when she heard the first gasp ripple through the plane like wind through wheat. She didn't turn immediately. She counted first, a habit from another life. Exits, 2 forward, 2 aft, 2 over wing. Distance to the man, 11 feet. Distance to the cockpit door, 32. Everyone stay in your seats, the man shouted, voice cracking on the last word. Young. Scared. Maybe more scared than the passengers. That was useful information. Scared men made mistakes. A second man rose from 22D, older, calmer, holding what looked like a second blade wrapped in duct tape near the hilt. A jailhouse shank, improvised, sharpened against concrete. Not airport security's oversight. Someone had built this weapon specifically for this flight. Danielle's pulse didn't spike. It settled, the way it used to before a breach, before extraction, before every moment where panic got people killed and stillness kept them breathing. A flight attendant named Carla froze near the galley, hand hovering over the interphone. Danielle caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. The younger man grabbed a passenger by the collar, a college kid in a hoodie, and hauled him into the aisle as a hostage, blade at his throat. I want to talk to the pilot, he said. Now. Danielle set the beverage cart's brake fully and stepped forward, hands open, voice even. I can take you to the cockpit door, she said. But it doesn't open without the captain say so. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. The man's eyes snapped to her, sizing her up and dismissing her the way people always did. 6 years earlier, in a compound outside Kandahar, a different version of Danielle Foster had learned that the moment someone dismissed you was the moment you had the advantage. She'd carried a different name then. On paper, she didn't exist at all. No service record, no unit patch, nothing that would show up in a Freedom of Information request. The agency called people like her non-official cover. Her handlers called her Ledger because she balanced things, cleaned things up, made columns add correctly again. She thought about that old call sign now, standing in a narrow aisle at 35,000 feet, a scared 22-year-old hostage taker 2 feet from her face. There was a thin white scar along the inside of her left wrist, the kind people assumed came from a kitchen accident if they noticed it at all. Carla had asked about it once, during a layover in Denver, over cheap diner coffee. Danielle had just said, old job, and let the silence do the rest. The truth was more complicated. The truth involved a rooftop, a radio that had gone silent for 4 minutes, and a decision she'd made in the dark that she'd never fully explained to anyone, including herself. Move, the younger hijacker said now, jerking the hostage forward. I said, take me to the cockpit. Okay, Danielle said, voice level as still water. Okay, let's walk. She glanced once toward the cockpit door, where she knew Captain Reynolds was watching through the peephole camera feed, confused about why the new flight attendant wasn't more afraid. She began walking forward, slow and unhurried, already counting the older man's blind spot. The cockpit intercom crackled. "Cabin crew, report status," Captain Reynolds said, his voice tight, controlled in the practice way pilots are trained for emergencies. But Danielle could hear the fear underneath it, thin as ice on a puddle. "Two males, edged weapons, one hostage," Danielle said in the handset before either hijacker could stop her, her tone flat and clinical, like she was reading a grocery list. "Demanding cockpit access." There was a pause on the other end, a pause that lasted a half-second too long for an ordinary flight attendant's report. "Copy that," Reynolds said slowly. "Ma'am, step back from the door." The younger hijacker's grip on the hostage tightened. "Who told you to talk on that radio?" "Standard procedure," Danielle said, setting the handset down with deliberate calm. "You want the cockpit to know what's happening, don't you? Or would you rather they guess?" He didn't have an answer for that. His partner, the older one, studied Danielle now with narrowed eyes, the first flicker of real doubt Danielle had seen from him. He'd noticed how she stood. Balanced weight, knees soft, shoulders square to the threat instead of turn away from it, the way frightened people naturally turn away. "You're not scared," the older man said, almost to himself. "I'm working," Danielle answered. Somewhere behind her, a woman in row 15 was crying quietly into her husband's shoulder. A child 3 rows up asked why the plane was so quiet. Danielle filed all of it away without looking, sound, position, threat radius, the way she used to file a room before deciding how to move through it. "Sit down, ma'am," the older man barked suddenly, gesturing at the nearest empty seat. "You don't get to stand here." Danielle didn't sit down. She didn't move at all. "Sit down," he said again, sharper this time, blade angling toward her. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." Something in Danielle's face changed. Not fear, not defiance, something quieter. Almost pity. "No," she said softly. "You don't understand who you're talking to." The words landed strange in the cabin, too calm for the moment, and for one full second nobody moved. Not the hijackers, not the hostage, not Carla by the galley, whose hand had drifted, slow and unnoticed, toward the interphone again. The younger man's eyes flicked between Danielle and his partner, uncertain now, like a soldier realizing his commanding officer had made a mistake and was too proud to admit it. Danielle used the silence. She always had. In another life, silence was the space where the real work happened. The half-second where a target's attention wavered, where a door's latch gave, where a hallway went from occupied to clear. She took one measured step to her left, angling her body so the hostage's line of sight opened toward the aft galley, toward Carla, toward the exit row, toward anywhere but the blade at his throat. The older hijacker caught the movement a beat too late. "Don't." But Danielle was already moving, and for the first time in 3 years, her hands weren't the hands of a flight attendant at all. Before we go further, if this story's got you hooked, drop a comment with where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and smash that like button. It helps more than you know. The move took less than a second. Danielle's left hand caught the hostage's wrist and yanked him sideways, off the blade's line, while her right forearm drove up and into the older hijacker's arm at the elbow joint. Not a punch, a redirection, the kind of economical violence that wasted no energy and announced nothing beforehand. The shank clattered onto the carpet. The college kid stumbled free into row 21, gasping, and someone in the back finally screamed the scream that had been building since the box cutter first caught the light. The younger hijacker lunged at her, and Danielle sidestepped, using his own momentum to put him face first into a seat back, pinning his wrist behind him with a grip that made him yelp before he even understood he'd lost. "Carla," Danielle called, voice still level, "zip ties. Galley, top drawer." Carla didn't ask why a flight attendant knew there were zip ties in the galley for exactly this purpose. She just moved. The older hijacker backed away, rubbing his elbow, staring at Danielle now with something closer to recognition than confusion, like a man trying to place a face he'd only ever seen in a briefing folder. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, an accusation. Danielle didn't answer. She was already scanning the cabin again, counting, recalculating. 2 hijackers down didn't mean the threat was over. It meant she didn't yet know the whole shape of it. The cockpit door's intercom crackled again. Cabin, report. When God's name just happened back there. Captain Reynolds' voice had lost its practiced calm entirely now. Through the tiny reinforced window in the cockpit door, he'd watched the whole thing on the aft camera feed, watched a flight attendant he'd exchanged maybe 6 sentences with over 3 years of shared flights, disarm 2 armed men in under 4 seconds. Cabin secure, for now, Danielle said into the handset, kneeling to bind the older hijacker's wrists herself, movements quick and practiced. 2 subjects restrained. I need you to divert. Nearest suitable runway now. Don't wait on company approval. Just declare the emergency. There was a long pause. Ma'am, I don't take instructions from. Captain. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the cockpit static like a blade through paper. I need you to trust me for the next 40 minutes. After that, you can write me up for whatever you want. Reynolds didn't answer right away. On the small monitor beside his yoke, he watched the woman he'd dismissed at the pre-flight briefing, the quiet one, the one who barely made eye contact, zip-tie a hijacker's wrists with the unhurried precision of somebody who had done this exact motion more times than she could count. Copy, he said finally, quieter now. Diverting to Shannon. ETA, 41 minutes. Behind Danielle, the older hijacker had stopped struggling. He was watching her hands instead, the calluses along her palms that didn't belong to someone who spent her days folding blankets and pouring ginger ale. You're not just crew, he said, almost to himself. Danielle checked the zip tie's tension, then finally met his eyes. No, she said. I'm not. What none of them knew yet. Not Reynolds, not Carla, not the passengers now murmuring in frightened clusters throughout the cabin, was that there had been a third man. He was seated in 4B, first class, and he had not moved once during the entire altercation. He had a tablet open on his tray table, displaying what looked like a boarding pass confirmation page. It was not a boarding pass confirmation page. Danielle noticed him the way she noticed everything now, a half-beat too still in a cabin full of motion, eyes tracking the aisle instead of the chaos. Professionals didn't panic. Professionals, batcha. She left the 2 restrained men with Carla and a retired Army medic 3 rows back who'd volunteered to keep an eye on them, and started forward, slow, unassuming, a flight attendant checking on first class after a disturbance. Just doing her job. The man in 4B closed his tablet as she approached. Everything okay back there? He asked. Mild, unbothered. 2, unbothered. Under control, Danielle said, straightening a blanket on the empty seat beside him, close enough now to see the corner of a photograph tucked into his jacket pocket. A photograph of an airport she recognized, a fuel depot she'd once walked past under very different circumstances, in a very different uniform. Her pulse, for the first time all flight, ticked upward. Not fear, recognition. She knew this man, or she knew men like him. And if he was here, this had never been about a hijacking at all. You should sit down, he said quietly, not looking at her. This isn't over yet, Ledger. The name hit her like a depressurization, sudden, total, all the air gone at once. Nobody had called her that in 6 years. Not since the rooftop. Not since the 4 minutes of radio silence that had ended her old life and started this one. The one with beverage carts and quiet apartments and a name that wasn't really hers, but had become hers anyway. Danielle didn't let her face move. Old training, older habit. I don't know what that means, she said. Sure you do. The man in 4B finally looked up at her, and there was nothing frightened in his expression at all. Only a kind of tired professional respect, the look one operator gives another when the pretense has run out. Kandahar. The Amin extraction. You were supposed to be a ghost story we told new recruits. Guess ghosts fly economy now. Behind her, 3 rows back, the older hijacker's head snapped up at the exchange, straining against his zip ties to listen. This was never about hostages, the man in 4B continued, voice low enough that only she could hear it over the cabin's residual murmur. Those 2 back there were a distraction. A loud one, so everyone would be looking at the aisle instead of the cargo hold. Danielle's stomach went cold in a way it hadn't in years. What's in a cargo hold? He smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. 41 minutes to Shannon, Ledger. I'd start moving faster than that. The cockpit intercom crackled once more, Reynolds' voice tight with a new kind of fear. Cabin, We're getting a hydraulic pressure warning. Left main gear. I don't understand it. We had zero indications on the ground. Danielle didn't wait for permission. She was already moving down the aisle toward the aft galley. Mind running calculations she hadn't run in years, but that surfaced instantly. Muscle memory older than the flight attendant uniform she wore. A hydraulic fault appearing spontaneously, 40 minutes into cruise, immediately following a distraction, hijacking stage specifically in the rear cabin. That wasn't coincidence. That was sabotage timed. She keyed the interphone. Captain, what's your left main gear pressure reading right now? Exact number. 600 and dropping, Reynolds said. We were at 2,900 on the ground checklist. Rate of drop. A pause while he checked. Maybe 40 psi a minute. Climbing. It's accelerating. Danielle's jaw tightened. The first outward sign of tension she'd allowed herself since the box cutter first caught the light. A slow, accelerating leak meant a physical breach somewhere in the hydraulic line, not an electronic fault, not a sensor glitch. Something had been done to that aircraft before it ever left the gate. Reynolds, listen to me carefully, she said. You are not going to have normal gear extension at Shannon. You need to brief for a gear-up contingency now, while you still have altitude and time to think, not later when you're on short final improvising. You're a flight attendant, Reynolds said, disbelief cracking through the transmission. How do you? I flew C-130s into strips that weren't strips for 6 years before I ever poured you a coffee, Danielle said. Trust me for the next 39 minutes, Captain. Please. Behind her, the man in 4B had gone very still, watching her with the expression of someone recalculating everything he thought he knew about how this flight was going to end. Silence answered her for 2 long seconds. Then, quieter, almost reluctant, copy. Briefing gear up contingency. Danielle exhaled just once and turned back toward 4B. He hadn't moved, hands folded on the closed tablet, watching her with an expression that had shifted from professional curiosity into something more careful. Calculating. You did this, she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't touch the hydraulics myself, he said. I'm not an idiot. I don't do wet work anymore. I coordinate. He said the word like it excused something. The 2 clowns in the back were supposed to keep everyone's eyes forward while the ground crew's little modification did its work at altitude. Nobody was supposed to notice until Shannon. Why Shannon? He smiled again, thinner this time. As your old friends. I'm sure they'll be very interested to know Amin's ledger finally resurfaced. The word landed with weight. Not just her old call sign, but the actual word, ledger, the literal thing she'd once been sent to recover from a burning building outside Kandahar, 6 years and 1 lifetime ago. A ledger of names. Financiers. People who very badly wanted it to stay lost, and who had apparently been waiting a long time for the right moment to make sure it did. Danielle's mind reorganized itself instantly, old instincts sliding into place like a magazine into a rifle. This was never random. Someone had waited years, tracked a woman who no longer officially existed, and built an elaborate hijacking around 1 flight, 1 hydraulic line, 1 runway in Ireland. Where is it? She asked quietly. The actual ledger. Not me. The real one. He didn't answer. He just glanced, almost involuntarily, toward the cargo hold beneath their feet. Danielle left him there. Restrained wasn't necessary yet. Not until she understood the full shape of the threat, and a man who talked was more valuable seated than zip-tied. She moved aft again, past frightened passengers who watched her now, with a strange new mixture of fear and hope, the way people look at someone who has just proven, without asking permission, that she knows exactly what she's doing. Carla met her at the galley curtain, pale but steady. The 2 in the back are secured. Medics got eyes on them. What did that guy say to you? Not now, Danielle said, not unkindly. I need the aircraft's cargo manifest. It'll be in the flight folder, laminated binder, should be behind the jump seat up front. Carla didn't ask why a flight attendant needed a cargo manifest during a hydraulic emergency. She'd stopped asking questions 3 minutes ago, somewhere around the moment Danielle disarmed 2 men with her bare hands. While Carla retrieved it, Danielle knelt beside the older hijacker, who had gone quiet, watchful, sizing her up in a way that suggested he understood Finally, exactly how far out of his depth he'd been from the very first minute. "Who hired you?" Danielle asked. He said nothing. "I'm not CIA anymore," she said, low enough that only he could hear. "I don't have rules about this the way I used to. But I also don't need to hurt you to get what I want. I just need a name." His eyes flicked involuntarily toward first class, toward 4B. "He didn't hire us," the man muttered finally. "He recruited us. Different thing. Told us it was a protest. Political statement. We didn't know about the plane itself. I swear it. We didn't know about the hydraulics." Carla returned, manifest in hand, and Danielle scanned it fast, eyes narrowing on a single-line item near the bottom. One crate, machine parts, consignee address that made her blood go cold. The consignee was a shell company she recognized instantly. Not from her current life, but from a mission report she'd filed and then watched get sealed 6 years ago, the kind of seal that meant somebody powerful hadn't wanted the details to exist anywhere, including in her own memory. The crate wasn't machine parts. She would have bet her life on it. In about 35 minutes, she might be doing exactly that. "Reynolds," she said into the interphone, "how are we doing on the gear-up briefing?" "Done," he said, voice tighter than before, but steadier now, the way pilots got when they had a plan to hold on to, even a bad one. "Phone trucks will be standing by at Shannon. I've got maybe 30 psi left in that line, and it's still bleeding." "Good. I need something else from you." "Cargo hold 2, after the wing box. Can your first officer access it from the flight deck cameras?" A pause. "We got a hold camera." "Why?" "Because there's a crate down there that isn't what the manifest says it is, and I need to know if it's rigged to do anything before we're on the ground with a hard landing and 41 psi worth of margin for error." The first officer's voice came through this time, younger, uncertain. "Ma'am, if there's something dangerous in the hold, shouldn't we be evacuating the area? Not looking at it?" "We're at 31,000 feet, Danielle said. "There's nowhere to evacuate to. I need eyes on that crate now, please." Somewhere behind her, the man in 4B had begun quietly working at something beneath his jacket, and Danielle's peripheral vision, trained across 100 rooms, 100 flights, 100 moments just like this one, caught the movement half a second before anyone else did. She was moving before she'd finished deciding to move, closing the distance to first class in 4 long strides, and her hand closed over his wrist just as it cleared his jacket, revealing not a weapon, but a small black device with a single blinking red light, thumb hovering over a recessed button. "Don't," she said, and for the first time all flight, there was something in her voice that sounded less like calm and more like a warning shot. "It's not what you think," he said, breathing hard now, the professional composure finally cracking at the edges. "It's not a detonator. It's a beacon, a locator for the crate, so our people on the ground know exactly where the wreckage is when this thing goes down at Shannon. You planned for us to crash. I planned for a controlled outcome," he said, and even now, even with her fingers locked hard around his wrist, there was something chillingly professional in how he said it, like a man discussing a spreadsheet. "The ledger surfaces one way or another. Either recovered from a hydraulic failure nobody can trace back to sabotage, or recovered from your dead body along with everyone else's on this plane. Either way, it stops being a threat to the people who sent me." Danielle felt something old and cold settle over her. The same feeling she'd had on the rooftop 6 years ago, the 4 minutes of silence, the decision she'd made and never told anyone about. "There are 91 passengers on this aircraft," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I read the manifest too." She took the beacon from his hand, and for 1/2 second, standing in the aisle of a crippled 767 somewhere over the Atlantic, Danielle Foster wasn't a flight attendant, wasn't Ledger, wasn't anyone with a name at all. She was just a woman deciding, again, who got to live. "Carla," she called back, voice steady again, professional mask fully restored, "I need you to secure this passenger the same as the other 2. Zip ties, aisle seat, someone watching him at all times." Carla moved without hesitation now, the retired Army medic falling in behind her, and together they walked the man out of first class while he offered no resistance at all. The fight had gone out of him the moment the beacon left his hand. The inner phone crackled. "Danielle," Reynolds' voice, using her actual name for the first time all flight. First officer's got eyes on the hold camera. There's a crate back there, and it's rigged with something. Wires. We can see wires. Copy, Danielle said, already moving toward the cockpit door. The aircraft's emergency crew procedures running through her mind alongside 6-year-old memories of ordnance disposal training she'd never expected to need again in this life. Don't touch it. Don't approach it. Don't let anyone near cargo hold 2. What is it? Danielle paused at the cockpit door, hand resting flat against the reinforced surface, aware of 91 lives on the other side of every decision she was about to make in the next 30 minutes. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I know how to find out, and I know how to keep it from mattering if I'm wrong. Let me in, Captain. I need to see what we're working with. There was a long pause, the sound of a latch disengaging, and then the cockpit door opened for the first time all flight, and Captain Mike Reynolds looked at the quiet flight attendant he'd barely acknowledged in 3 years of shared trips, and for the first time really looked at her. Who are you? He said quietly. Later, Danielle said, stepping inside. Fly the plane, Captain. I've got the rest. The flight deck was smaller than Danielle remembered cockpits being, all amber warning lights and the low hydraulic whine of a wounded aircraft still holding together at 31,000 feet. The first officer, a young man named Andrew Coleman, glanced back at her with wide eyes, half question, half plea for someone, anyone, to have a plan. Danielle leaned over his shoulder to study the hold camera feed. The crate sat wedged against the aft bulkhead, ordinary gray composite, the kind that could hold anything from machine parts to something far worse. A thin wire ran from its seam to a small box mounted against the fuselage wall, not explosive in the way she'd first feared. Simpler, uglier. It's not a bomb, she said after a moment, exhaling. It's a secondary hydraulic tap. Someone spliced into your gear system's actuator line from inside that crate. That's your leak, Captain. It's not a fault. It's a valve, and it's been bleeding your pressure on a timer since we hit cruise altitude. Why? Reynolds said, hand steady on the yoke despite everything. Because a slow hydraulic failure over open ocean looks like bad luck, Danielle said. Nobody investigates bad luck as hard as they investigate sabotage. It was supposed to fail quietly enough that any wreckage at Shannon told a clean story. Mechanical failure, tragic, nothing to trace back to anyone. Coleman's voice cracked slightly. Can we stop it? The leak. Danielle was already running the numbers in her head. Remaining PSI, rate of loss, minutes to Shannon, the physics of what a gear-up landing would mean for 91 people versus what a hard, unassisted gear-down landing might mean if she could buy back even half the lost pressure. Maybe, she said, but I need to get into that hold, and I need it now. Reynolds turned in his seat for the first time since she'd entered the cockpit, giving her a long look, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about authority, about who deserved deference on his aircraft. That hold isn't pressurized for people during flight, he said. Not safely. Not without gear. There's a crawlway access panel aft to the wing box, isn't there? Danielle said. It wasn't a question. She'd studied 767 systems more thoroughly than any flight attendant training manual required, a fact she'd never once mentioned to a single coworker in 3 years. Emergency maintenance access. I need a headset, a flashlight, and about 6 minutes. That access panel requires depressurizing that section of the hold, Coleman said. It's not designed to be opened at altitude. I know, Danielle said. I also know it can be done in a controlled way if someone up here manages cabin pressure differential while I'm working, which is why I need both of you focused on flying this aircraft while I handle the part that isn't flying. Reynolds studied her for one more second, then nodded once, sharp and final, a captain's decision made. Coleman, get her a headset. I want constant comms the entire time she's back there. As Danielle turned to leave the flight deck, Reynolds spoke again, quieter. Whatever you were before all this, thank you for being on this flight. Danielle paused at the door, something almost gentle passing behind her eyes. Fly the plane, Captain, she said again. Save the thank yous for the ground. She stepped back into the cabin, where 91 frightened passengers watched her walk past like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. The maintenance crawlway was barely wide enough for her shoulders, lit only by the beam of a flashlight clenched between her teeth as she worked her way aft, headset crackling with Coleman's voice, reading altitude and pressure figures in a steady, controlled cadence that reminded her, absurdly, of every combat comms channel she'd ever worked. PSI at 410, Coleman said. Losing about 35 a minute now. Copy, Danielle said, voice tight with exertion as she pulled herself past a bundle of hydraulic lines toward the crate's location. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cold. Her hands found the spliced valve exactly where the camera feed had shown it. Crude, effective, clearly built by someone who understood aircraft systems well enough to be dangerous and not well enough to hide the work cleanly. She traced the wire back to a small manual shutoff she hadn't been able to see on camera, tucked behind a support rib. Her fingers closed around it. If I close this, she said, mostly to herself, it isolates the tap, but it might also isolate legitimate flow to the actuator. I could stop the bleed, or I could kill what's left of your gear pressure entirely. Your call, Reynolds said over the headset, voice steady despite the impossible weight of what he'd just said. You've gotten us this far. Danielle closed her eyes for 1/2 second. The same half second she'd taken on a rooftop 6 years ago, the decision that had cost her the life she used to have and given her this one instead. Then she turned the valve. The pressure gauge reading, relayed through Coleman's voice, held steady for 3 full seconds that felt like 3 years. 405, Coleman said slowly. 405. It's holding. Danielle, it's holding steady. Relief hit her harder than the fear had, a physical wave that made her brace one hand against the crawlway wall. 405 psi wasn't full pressure. It wasn't a guarantee of normal gear extension. But it was enough to give a landing gear a fighting chance, enough to turn a certain gear-up emergency into a probable, survivable, ordinary hard landing. There's residual pressure trapped in the actuator line, she said, working her way back toward the crawlway hatch. It won't refill what you lost, but it should be enough for gear extension with backup hydraulics assisting. You're not out of the woods, Captain, but you're not in free fall anymore either. Copy that, Reynolds said, and for the first time all flight, there was something almost like hope in his voice. ETA Shannon, 22 minutes. Danielle pulled herself free of the crawlway hatch and back into the aft galley, breathing hard, hands streaked with hydraulic fluid and grease, looking for the first time since the box cutter first caught the light, exactly like the flight attendant everyone had assumed she was. Carla was waiting for her there, wide-eyed. 22 minutes, she repeated. You crawled into the belly of the plane and fixed it. I bought us time, Danielle said, wiping her hands on a galley towel. Landing's still going to be rough. Get the cabin briefed for a hard landing brace position. Full review. No shortcuts. On it, Carla said, already moving. Then she paused, looking back. Danielle, who are you? Danielle allowed herself the smallest, tiredest smile. Later, brief the cabin. 22 minutes felt longer than the 6 years that had passed since Kandahar. Danielle moved through the cabin, helping Carla brief passengers on brace positions, her hand steady even as her mind ran through every landing gear failure scenario she'd ever studied. Every worst case stacked against every best case, weighing odds she'd once weighed for a living and had hoped never to weigh again. The older hijacker watched her from his zip-tied seat as she passed, something like shame settling into his expression now that the adrenaline had drained out of him. I didn't know, he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. About the plane, about any of it. I swear, I believe you, Danielle said, and meant it. That won't undo what happened today, but it might matter later. In first class, the man who'd called her Ledger sat silent, watching her with the flat, calculating stillness of someone already rehearsing what he'd say to the people who'd sent him, if he ever got the chance to speak to them again. The cockpit intercom crackled. Cabin crew, 10 minutes to Shannon. Brace positions on final approach, full emergency protocol. Fire and rescue standing by on the runway. Danielle took her jump seat near the aft galley, buckling in beside Carla, whose hands were shaking now that there was finally a quiet moment to let them. Are we going to be okay? Carla asked. Danielle thought about the 405 psi trapped in a battered hydraulic line, about a vow she'd turned with her own hands 8,000 feet below the flight deck, about a decision made in half a second that either would or wouldn't hold for the next 10 minutes. "We have a good chance," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. The final approach into Shannon was the longest 10 minutes of Danielle's life, and she'd lived through some long ones. Through the small cabin windows, passengers watched emergency vehicles arrayed along the runway like a red and white honor guard, lights strobing silently against the gray Irish evening. Reynolds' voice came over the PA, steady now, a captain's voice fully back in command of his aircraft. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Brace positions on my command." Danielle felt the aircraft's nose dip slightly as Reynolds began the approach, felt the subtle shudder as the landing gear began its extension sequence. The moment of truth for 405 psi borrowed, trapped pressure that either would or wouldn't be enough. Gear coming down, Coleman's voice reported over the cockpit speaker, tension audible even through the static. Left main showing green. I have gear down and locked left side." A ragged, disbelieving cheer rippled through the cabin. "Right main green. Nose gear green," Coleman continued. "Captain, we have 3 green lights. Full gear extension." Danielle closed her eyes for 1/2 second, the same half second she always allowed herself, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since Kandahar. "Brace, brace, brace." Reynolds' voice cut through the cabin, and 91 passengers folded forward into position as the runway rushed up to meet them, for 105 psi, carrying a wounded aircraft home. The wheels hit hard, harder than a normal landing, the whole aircraft shuddering with a metallic groan that ran through Danielle's teeth, but they held. The gear held. Reynolds fought the yoke as the plane decelerated, reverse thrusters screaming, emergency vehicles falling into formation alongside the fuselage as it rolled to a stop on the runway at Shannon. For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. Then the cabin erupted, not panic this time, but relief, sobbing, laughter, strangers gripping each other's hands across the aisle. Carla was crying openly now, no longer bothering to hide it, and Danielle allowed herself one small, tired exhale before unbuckling and rising to do the only thing that mattered now: get 91 people off this aircraft safely. The evacuation was orderly, almost calm, the way evacuations only go when someone competent is directing them. Danielle moved through the cabin one final time, checking rows, checking faces, making sure nobody was left behind. Not the hijackers, not the man from 4B, not a single frightened passenger. Emergency personnel swarmed the aircraft the moment the doors opened, and somewhere in the chaos of fire trucks and stretchers and shouted instructions, a different kind of vehicle pulled up on the tarmac. Unmarked black, government in a way that had nothing to do with airport security. 2 men in dark suits stepped out and walked directly toward the aircraft, bypassing the emergency response teams entirely, eyes scanning the disembarking passengers until they found exactly who they were looking for. Ledger, one of them said quietly, once she was close enough to hear, and something in Danielle's chest tightened to the sound of a name she hadn't answered to in 6 years. "It's Danielle now," she said. The older of the 2 men, silver-haired, government-issue calm, studied her for a long moment. "We got a flash alert 40 minutes ago. Sabotaged hydraulic system. Hijacking a ledger connected to the amine extraction, resurfacing on a commercial flight. We didn't know you were on it. We didn't know you were still." He stopped himself. "Still alive," Danielle finished for him. "Still flying, technically, just not the way I used to." Behind her, Captain Reynolds emerged from the aircraft, exhausted, uniform soaked through with sweat, and found himself staring at the unmarked vehicle. The men in suits, the quiet reverence with which they addressed a woman he'd known for 3 years as nothing more than reliable, quiet cabin crew. "You're really CIA," he said. Not quite a question anymore. "Was," Danielle said. "Long time ago." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment, then extended his hand. A formal gesture, oddly ceremonial on a chaotic tarmac, full of flashing lights and stretchers. "I told you to sit down," he said quietly. "Back on plane." "You did. I didn't know who I was talking to." "No," Danielle said, the ghost of a smile finally reaching her eyes. You didn't. The debrief took 3 hours, most of it in a windowless room at the airport that smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. Danielle answering the same questions she'd once been trained to ask, now sitting on the other side of the table for the first time in her life. When it was finally over, she found Reynolds waiting outside, out of uniform now, holding 2 cups of coffee he'd clearly bought from a vending machine somewhere in the terminal. Figured you'd earned this, he said, handing one over. Danielle took it, the warmth welcome after a day that had started with a beverage cart and ended with a hydraulic valve 8,000 feet underground. Thank you. For what it's worth, Reynolds said, the airline's going to want to give you some kind of commendation. Press probably will too, once this gets out. It won't get out, Danielle said simply. Not the real version, anyway. Reynolds studied her, something like understanding settling over his face. You're just going to go back to pouring coffee on economy flights. Like nothing happened. That's the job, Danielle said. The one I actually signed up for this time. Carla found them a few minutes later, exhausted, red-eyed, but smiling in the loose, disbelieving way of someone who'd survived something enormous. They're already rebooking us for a flight home tomorrow, she said. You believe that? 12 hours after almost dying, and they want us back in the air. Danielle looked out at the tarmac, at the wounded 767 still being inspected under floodlights, at the quiet Irish evening settling over an airport that had no idea how close it had come to a very different kind of headline. I'll be on it, she said. Somebody's got to pour the coffee. 3 weeks later, Danielle Foster was back on her regular route, pushing a beverage cart down a narrow aisle at 35,000 feet, nodding politely at passengers who had no idea what her hand were capable of. Nobody on this flight knew her real name. Not the one that mattered, anyway. Somewhere in a government building she'd never see again, a report was quietly filed and quietly sealed, the same way her old life had always ended, without fanfare, without recognition, without anyone outside a small windowless room ever knowing what she'd done. That suited her fine. She hadn't done it for the thank you. Captain Reynolds still flew the same route sometimes. When their paths crossed at the gate, he always gave her a small nod. Not the dismissive one from before, but something quieter, something earned. Ma'am, he said once, with the faintest trace of a smile. Captain, she answered, matching it. Neither of them ever mentioned Shannon again. They didn't need to. If this story hit home, drop a like and leave a comment telling me. If you were on that flight, would you have trusted the quiet flight attendant, or would it have taken a lot more than that to convince you? Subscribe for more unforgettable military and aviation stories, because the next one might just start the same way this one did, with someone telling her to sit down.